Welcome to the Belly Button Window channel and episode 15 of the Jimi Hendrix story, like you've never heard it before. In this episode, we examine October 1967, including the various gigs, recording sessions for the Axis, Bold as Love LP, and the critical events for that month. Please remember to check the channel's community tab and video information page, where you will find links to related videos, performances, and stunning photographs from the period. About the Axis recording sessions, Mitch Mitchell in his autobiography had this to say: "We didn't approach Axis that differently from the first one, Are You Experienced? Although it didn't seem to be as much of a rush. There was a fair amount of material already there to be done, but as usual a lot of stuff got tried out in the studio and it either clicked or it didn't. Experienced was very much, wham, bam, thank you, next track. Axis, Bold as Love was like that as well to a degree, if only because there was pressure on us to produce a good follow-up, but much less so. From my side, I felt happy to be in the studio, particularly at Olympic. Working on Axis was the first time that it became apparent that Jimmy was pretty good working behind the board, as well as playing, and had some positive ideas of how he wanted things recorded. It could have been the start of any potential conflict between him and Chaz in the studio. Chaz was fair, though, and realized that Hendrix knew what he was doing, and there were engineers, like Eddie Kramer, who were among the first to experiment with phasing or flanging sound, who could really improve things. It was about that time that I realized that Hendrix could play something forwards and know exactly how it would if it was played back in reverse. An amazing facility. Where tempers did start to get a little frayed was over retakes. Chaz was quite happy for layers of overdubs and effects to be put on a track, but he tried to draw the line over simply doing more and more takes of the same thing. All he could see was the budget going up and up all the time. Noel didn't really like spending that much time in the studio, especially doing take after take. Often it would get to the point where he would go over the road to the pub. When that happened, Jimmy and I would often continue without him, which was no big deal really. We would lay down guitar and drums or bass and drums, but usually it meant that Noel could come in later and add his bass part. Not that unusual, standard recording procedure really. Jimmy was helped a lot by Roger Meyer, who'd basically invented fuzz boxes. He started developing equipment specifically for Jimmy to enable him to produce the sounds he wanted. On the first album, neither Noel nor I had any say in how we actually sounded. We laid down tracks and that was it. Chaz recorded it and mixed it virtually alone. Even Jimmy only had a limited say. He knew the overall sound he wanted, but ultimately what Chaz said went. Listening back to it now, I think Chaz did an extremely good job with the equipment and facilities available. But by the second album, Jimmy had started to find his feet, and Noel and I wanted some kind of impact with regards to our sound. Chaz did his best to put up with us, which can't have been easy. I think he and Jimmy were still sharing a flat together, and consequently living in each other's pockets. I think that is going to lead to strain in any relationship. About the Axis recording sessions, Mitch Mitchell, in his autobiography, had this to say: "We didn't approach Axis that differently from the first one, Are You Experienced? Although it didn't seem to be as much of a rush. There was a fair amount of material already there to be done, but as usual a lot of stuff got tried out in the studio, and it either clicked or it didn't. Experienced was very much wham bam, thank you, next track. Axis, Bold as Love was like that as well to a degree, if only because there was pressure on us to produce a good follow-up, but much less so. From my side, I felt happy to be in the studio, particularly at Olympic. Working on Axis was the first time that it became apparent that Jimmy was pretty good working behind the board, as well as playing, and had some positive ideas of how he wanted things recorded. It could have been the start of any potential conflict between him and Chaz in the studio. Chaz was fair, though, and realized that Hendrix knew what he was doing, and there were engineers, like Eddie Kramer, who were among the first to experiment with phasing or flanging sound, who could really improve things. It was about that time that I realized that Hendrix could play something forwards and know exactly how it would if it was played back in reverse. An amazing facility. Where tempers did start to get a little frayed was over retakes. Chaz was quite happy for layers of overdubs and effects to be put on a track, but he tried to draw the line over simply doing more and more takes of the same thing. All he could see was the budget going up and up all the time. Noel didn't really like spending that much time in the studio, especially doing take after take. Often it would get to the point where he would go over the road to the pub. When that happened, Jimmy and I would often continue without him, which was no big deal really. We would lay down guitar and drums or bass and drums, but usually it meant that Noel could come in later and add his bass part. Not that unusual standard recording procedure really. Jimmy was helped a lot by Roger Meyer, who'd basically invented fuzzboxes. He started developing equipment specifically for Jimmy to enable him to produce the sounds he wanted. On the first album, neither Noel nor I had any say in how we actually sounded. We laid down tracks and that was it. Chas recorded it and mixed it virtually alone. Even Jimmy only had a limited say. He knew the overall sound he wanted, but ultimately what Chas said went. Listening back to it now, I think Chas did an extremely good job with the equipment and facilities available. But by the second album, Jimmy had started to find his feet, and Noel and I wanted some kind of impact with regards to our sound. Chas did his best to put up with us, which can't have been easy. I think he and Jimmy were still sharing a flat together and consequently living in each other's pockets. I think that is going to lead to strain in any relationship. The strain was certainly showing between the band and Chas by the time we did the track, Bold as Love. I particularly wanted to go with the flanging sound on the drums and finish the album with something quite big and impressive. That took a long time to set up in the studio. Chas's patience definitely started wearing thin, but we were allowed to do it. So, from the 1st through to the 5th of October, the group was focused on recording at the Olympic Sound Studios, London. October 1st saw the recording of Little Miss Lover and One Rainy Wish. In relation to the recording of One Rainy Wish, aka Golden Rose, the studio records indicate that 9 incomplete takes of this song were recorded on the 1st of October, with 6 additional takes on the 2nd of October session. Take 15, the last version, became the master. The lead vocal overdub took place on the 14th of October, and the final mixing for this song was done on the 31st of October. October 2nd, at Olympic Studios, London, and recording Little Miss Lover, One Rainy Wish and You Got Me Floatin'. In relation to the recording of You Got Me Floatin', the song title is You Got Me Floatin', but the title on the original track records release is You've Got Me Floating, which is also how the song was originally copyrighted, although on some official releases the title is You Got Me Floatin'. Studio records suggest the track used was take 7 from the session, although this has been disputed with some believing track 4 yielded the master. Final mixing for this song was done on the 31st of October, 1967. Interestingly, the track which primarily contains the backwards guitar and voices segments in the song, when reversed, reveals the presence of what sounds like an old-fashioned wind-up music box. Personnel: Jimi Hendrix, guitar, vocals; Noel Redding, bass, vocals; Mitch Mitchell, drums, vocals; Trevor Burton, backing vocals; Graham Nash, backing vocals; Roy Wood, backing vocals; unknown tambourine; unknown music box. Chas Chandler has stated that Trevor Burton and Roy Wood were mates of Noel's, and that's how they came in and sang on the song. You Got Me Floatin' shows Jimmy in full experimentation mode. The multiplication of tracks became his obsession, and despite the limits of the recording techniques of the time, that is recording on a 4-track recorder, he pushed the boundaries. According to Hendrix author John McDermott, Chandler found the title You Got Me Floatin' weak, and so this is why he put it at the beginning of the second side, in order to get rid of it as quickly as possible, before tackling serious matters. Perhaps suggesting that Chandler as the producer ultimately decided the order, perhaps even the choice of the different titles. October 3rd, Olympic Studios and the recording of Little Miss Lover. Personnel: Jimi Hendrix, guitar, vocals; Noel Redding, playing the 8-string Hagstrom bass; Mitch Mitchell, drums; Trevor Burton, harmony vocals; Chris Kefford or Roy Wood, harmony vocals; tambourine, possibly Jimmy but unknown; special effects: Jimmy using the Octavia and a Pultec filter on his lead vocals. October 4th, Olympic Studios recording, untitled Jimmy Demo 1, Ain't No Tellin' and Bold as Love. The introductory track, EXP, was originally recorded the 5th of May 1967. Composers are listed as James Marshall Hendrix, John Graham, Mitch Mitchell, and David Noel Redding. Personnel: Jimi Hendrix, guitar voice; Mitch Mitchell, voice. There's no real bass in this song. The Experience did a couple of guitars, turned the volume up full and smashed them against the amplifiers, and that's all the noise in Part B. This track was originally recorded under the title Symphony of Experience. Special notes: final mixing for this song was done on the 31st of October 1967, with George Chkiance as second engineer. But this song, which was part of side A of the album, as we will later discuss, was lost by Hendrix when he left the master tape box in a taxicab that night. The track had to be completely remixed the following day, on the 1st of November. October 5th at Olympic Studios, and the recording Bold as Love and Castles Made of Sand. Also on that day, Gerard Mankiewicz photographs the Jimi Hendrix experience at Manson's yard. As to the recording of Bold as Love, personnel: Jimi Hendrix, guitar, harpsichord, vocals; Noel Redding, bass; Mitch Mitchell, drums. Special effect, phasing particularly on drums. Mitch noted that the strain was certainly showing between the band and Chaz by the time we did the track. Bold as Love. I particularly wanted to go with the flanging sound on the drums and finish the album with something quite big and impressive. That took a long time to set up in the studio. Chaz's patience definitely started wearing thin, but we were allowed to do it. Friday, October 6th, performance at the Playhouse Theatre, London for BBC Radio's Top Gear programme, including an interview by Brian Matthews, later broadcast on Sunday, October 15th. While at the Playhouse Theatre, Jimi Hendrix and Noel Redding take part in a jam session with Stevie Wonder on drums for BBC Radio 1, Friday rock show, not broadcast until the 25th of May 1979. As Noel Redding recalled, "While at the BBC, we were introduced to Stevie Wonder. When Mitch nipped off to the loo, some enterprising person suggested an informal jam between Jimmy and myself, with Stevie on drums. We jammed 2 segments. Then Stevie sang an old R&B song called Not Too Proud to Beg or something like that. Of course, they forgot to turn the tapes off. This jam was aired a couple of times and bootlegged." Setlist for the Top Gear October 6th performance was Jammin', I Was Made to Love Her, Little Miss Lover, Catfish Blues, The Burning of the Midnight Lamp, Driving South, and Hound Dog. These recordings are present on the album BBC Radio 1 Sessions, which surprisingly was not officially released until 1989. Reviews of the recordings note that Driving South in particular represents one of the experience's finest pieces of ensemble playing, led by some breathtaking guitar that swoops, dives, and motors on relentlessly. If the word tight means anything in music, then Driving South was a peerless example. During the same session, they laid down Jimmy's tribute to Muddy Waters, Catfish Blues, featuring a drum solo by Mitch. This was before the heyday of the obligatory drum solo, when, however awful, every drummer beat his kit to a pulp for 20 minutes. Fact is, Mitch's expansive drumming style, like Keith Moon, made soloing largely redundant. They also played a very different version of Midnight Lamp, which had just entered the UK charts, with no additional instrumentation or background vocals. The final song was a throwaway version of Hound Dog, with Noel and Mitch baying in the background. October 7th, the group performs at the Wellington Club Dereham. Band lineup: Jimi Hendrix Experience, Flower People, and Rubber Band. The Experience's setlist: Purple Haze, Hey Joe, Foxy Lady, and The Wind Cries Mary. October 8th, performance at the Saville Theatre, London. Band lineup: Jimi Hendrix Experience, Crazy World of Arthur Brown, John's Children, and Crying Shames. The Experience's setlist: The Wind Cries Mary, Burning of the Midnight Lamp, Hound Dog, Can You Please Crawl Out Your Window, Purple Haze, Foxy Lady, and Wild Thing. Monday, October 9th, performing at the Olympia, Paris. Jimmy is interviewed in his Paris hotel room at the St. Petersburg by Mike Hennessy for Music Maker. Published in February 1968. While in Paris, the Experience resides at the St. Petersburg Hotel at 35 Rue de Caumartin, 75009 Paris. The St. Petersburg Hotel is a family hotel in the center of Paris between the Opera Garnier and the Madeleine. Review of the recording made of Olympia performance: The Hendrix Setlist, Stone Free, Hey Joe, Fire, Catfish Blues, Burning of the Midnight Lamp, Foxy Lady, The Wind Cries Mary, Rock Me Baby, Red House, Purple Haze, and Wild Thing. The concert begins with a solid and effective Stone Free, played in a very rock spirit. The solo is concise. It was only several months later that it would become the scene of long improvisations. After side B, Jimi continues with side A of the first single of the experience, Hey Joe. The group of course masters this title to perfection, even if the last chromatic rise experiences some hesitations. The central solo is brilliantly performed with the teeth, while we guess the next one, like what he did in Monterey, played behind the back. The showman does not, however, take too much advantage over the musician. On Fire, Jimi's rhythm and blues background still clearly emerges in his way of singing. If the first solo is very short and modelled on the studio version, the second is a little more original, especially when he sculpts a long feedback with its vibrato lever. Catfish Blues, then unreleased before its official release, is unfortunately cut at the end. Foxy Lady is excellent, but Jimi's microphone does not work during the first half, which probably explains why it remains unreleased from the official catalogue. Jimi then announces Rock Me Baby, but specifying that they are going to do it their way. The central solo is quite uneven. The visual sometimes takes precedence over the musical. We can guess the beginning of a solo where Jimi eroticizes his instrument, an instrument which he plays again with his teeth afterwards. As he announces Red House, Jimi confirms having some technical issues with his guitar. This is only the second documented release of what would become a mainstay of his repertoire in the months to come. As on the studio version, the title is played in shuffle at a medium tempo. Unlike this one, the solo has long developments. It is 4 times longer than on Are You Experienced? This is undoubtedly one of the highlights of this concert, where the group is already moving away from the blues as it was played then in Chicago. Mitch Mitchell's playing leans towards jazz, while the use of fuzz leads Jimi to phrase things differently from what his contemporaries did. The relationship with the silence of the great bluesman gives way here to the obsession with fullness. Silence being impossible when he plays like this, Jimi reinvents the tension-release balance in his own way. Then Noel Redding announces the following title, Purple Haze, but Jimi doesn't attack the A side of his second single. I'm going to say something in French. I like you a lot, okay? I can say Eiffel Tower too. He then offers to explain the meaning of Purple Haze to those who do not speak English. He then launches into a noisy introduction, which remains relatively brief, the theme of Purple Haze ringing out shortly after. Jimi's interventions as a soloist are certainly very visual, because they lack real direction. He also plays the finale with his teeth. Jimi then invites the audience to sing the last title of the concert with the experience, gently mocking Otis Redding and Wilson Pickett in the process, before specifying that they are great but that the experience has its thing. Jimi takes some time to retune, but with an obvious and communicative good humor, Wild Thing is present as a powerful version, but very visual again, where Noel Redding is very present during the vocal parts. Jimi says, thank you very much, to the audience before concluding the concert with a noisy finale. This second visit of the group to Paris marks a triumphant return, because barely a year earlier, they had opened for Johnny Hallyday, and now they have an audience of 14,000 fans in front of them, to which Jimi took the opportunity to thank the audience. October 10th, French television. A portrait of Marie Laforêt, a French television program in which the Jimi Hendrix experience performs. The burning of the midnight lamp in playback, or mimed with a cityscape background, later broadcast on Saturday, October 21st, 1967. October 11th, Paris for the television program Le Petit Dimanche Illustrated, presented by Gerard Klein. The group performs The Wind Cries Mary and Burning of the Midnight Lamp, both mimed. The clips are filmed near the entrance to the Denfert-Rochereau metro station. The first filming took place in the morning, followed in the afternoon, with a second filming, which took place on a demolition site. October 12th, 1967. Paris. Recordings for the French television show Discorama, performing The Wind Cries Mary and The Burning of the Midnight Lamp, later broadcast November 12th, 1967. Discorama was a French musical and cultural television show, created and presented by Denise Glaser and broadcast from February 4th, 1959 to January 5th, 1975 on RTF television. Jimi mimes a melodic accompaniment with a piano and a violin, broadcast on November 12th, 1967. Later that day, recording for the French television program Dim Dam Dom, presented by Sophie Daumier and Guy Bedos, broadcast on November 12th, where the group performs Hey Joe and The Burning of the Midnight Lamp, both were mimed. Friday, October 13th, 1967, back in England, performing at Boreham Wood, Hertfordshire, recording for ATV Television's Good Evening programme, with presenter Jonathan King, broadcast October 14th and 16. The group performs Little Miss Lover, pre-recorded live, playback vocals live. Saturday, October 14th, back at Olympic Studios, London, recording Little Wing, South Saturn Delta. On the same day, Jimi is interviewed in London for Melody Maker, published on Saturday, October 28th. Sunday, October 15th, interview for the Crawley Observer in Crawley, published on Friday, October 20th, 1967, followed by Starlight Ballroom, Crawley, Sussex, The Set List, Are You Experienced? Hey Joe, Purple Haze, Foxy Lady, Jam and Wild Thing. The following is a review from the concert at the Starlight Ballroom, which appeared in the Crawley and District Observer, titled Jimi Hendrix Excites 900. A rare and exciting performance was given by the Jimi Hendrix Experience before an audience of 900 at the Starlight Ballroom, Crawley, on Sunday. After an electrical fault in one of the amplifiers had been put right, the Experience broke into their first number, a track from their LP called Are You Experienced? This was followed by a couple of earthy blues numbers which were greatly appreciated by the swaying audience. Then, getting every last decibel out of the huge 100-watt amplifiers, Jimi broke into his biggest hit ever in this country, Hey Joe, in which he plays the guitar with his teeth, rubs the neck of his instrument against the microphone stand, and plays behind his back and through his legs. The audience loved it. He played other big numbers like Purple Haze and Foxy Lady. Grand finale was his rendering of the number which stopped the show at the Monterey Pop Festival in America recently, Wild Thing. In his dressing room afterwards, he said the group had just returned from France and were extremely tired. He said the Crawley audience were lovely people, and he was pleased with their reaction. Jimi had a bloody right hand which he had apparently torn on the strings of his guitar. October 17th, London, radio recordings for Rhythm and Blues BBC session and for BBC World Service, broadcast the 12th of November 1967, with performances of Hoochie Coochie Man, with introduction, Can You Please Crawl Out Your Window, and Driving South. Also on the same day, American photographer Joel Elkin does a photo shoot in Hyde Park with the Experience. Later that evening, Jimi Hendrix plays with John Mayall's Bluesbreakers at Cluck's Cleek, London, briefly replacing Mick Taylor. John Mayall said of Jimi, "When he sat down with you, he fell right into what you were doing. He was just a natural musician, and I don't think showmanship was a part of his personality. He loved to play, he listened to music, and he loved the attention he received." While Mick Taylor related, "I thought he was amazing. For a guitarist, having that energy in your playing but also control and rhythm. You know, for most guitarists it's extremely difficult to play like that, or even to play anywhere near that standard in a three-piece band. I mean, Eric Clapton did it with Cream, and Hendrix was great. He went from rhythm to lead. His guitar and voice sounded almost the same." The BBC sessions, a review of the recordings, mostly comprising the BBC radio material, recorded October 1967, plus a few alternate takes and a few TV recordings. The recordings contain all the best material from the BBC sessions, plus a very loose, never-broadcast jam with Stevie Wonder on drums, titled Jammin', and an amusing take on Dylan's obscure Can You Please Crawl Out Your Window. There's also the famous Hendrix practical joke at Lulu's expense, when he ran over the end of her show with an impromptu Cream tribute, Sunshine of Your Love. But the highlights are still the stripped-down version of Burning of the Midnight Lamp, the turbocharged instrumental Driving South, a rip-off of Albert Collins' Thaw Out, the hilarious Radio 1 jingle, and Hoochie Coochie Man with host Alexis Corner on slide guitar. Though there's a hefty assortment of hits, there are more covers, Hound Dog, and album tracks, Little Miss Lover, and the loose atmosphere of the recordings adds to the fun. And to be sure, there's no truth to the rumor that John Lennon appears on the cover of Day Tripper. The co-lead vocal is Redding's. October 18th, Jimi goes to the premiere of the film How I Won the War, featuring John Lennon. Jimi, Chaz Chandler, and Lotta, Chaz's wife, are invited to attend the premiere of Richard Lester's film How I Won the War, in which John Lennon has a role. Earlier in the day, the Experience is photographed by Donald Silverstein in London. October 19th, Jimi is interviewed in his apartment at 43 Upper Berkeley Street in London, by Christine Osborne for Fabulous 208, published Saturday, November 4th. In the early recording days of the experience, Jimi generally went along with what Chaz suggested. But with every visit to the studio, and particularly with the Axis recording sessions, Jimi's confidence had grown, as Eddie Kramer explained. There were no meetings in advance, and Jimi created everything in a very loose sort of fashion. He knew in his own head what he wanted to do and how he wanted to create. He had pages and pages of lyrics to choose from, but he knew exactly what he was doing. Every overdub, every backward guitar solo, every double-tracked thing was carefully worked out, in his own head. In a very private sense. I was not to know what he was going to do until he walked into the studio. I don't think anybody else did. Take any of the backwards guitar solos, and there are quite a number of them. When the tape was put on backwards, with the music rushing by you, Jimi knew where he was every inch of that tape. It didn't matter where you started it, and he knew exactly in his own mind, as he was doing the solo, what it would sound like afterwards. The point is, the man had a firm grasp of what he was doing and what its end result would be. According to authors Harry Shapiro and Caesar Glebeek, Chaz, as producer, always had one eye on the budget and was forever proud of the fact that The House of the Rising Sun had been recorded for £4 over a lunchtime and was still a smash hit all around the world. Jimi, on the other hand, growing in confidence, had a clear idea of what he wanted. He didn't exactly ignore Chaz, but somehow, at the end, he prevailed. Neville Chesters remembers, "I do recall a number of times he and Jimi having fairly harsh words about how things ought to be done." Noel, on the other hand, was much happier on the stage than in the studio, and shared Chaz's exasperation with Jimi's insistence on carrying on until it sounded right to his way of thinking. Noel quickly tired of Jimi's recording technique, and also resented Jimi showing him what to play. Mitch, on the other hand, says Eddie Kramer, was another story altogether. Mitch had the ability to almost read what Jimi was thinking. Even though Jimi would dictate a lot of things to play, where to put accent, and where to fit fills, it was generally left up to Mitch's imagination, which was pretty vivid. Jimi would never cease to be amazed by Mitch's ability to play ridiculous things. Perhaps the only thing that Jimi was not at all confident about was his singing. He didn't want anybody to even watch him sing. Eddie Kramer had to dim the studio lights to put Jimi in the shadows while he laid down vocals. In the studio, Jimi was keen to recreate the power of his live performances, which meant cranking everything up to meltdown. The strain this put on studio equipment was immense. However, whatever conflicts there may have been between competing forces in the studio, these never actually got in the way of working. In fact, they could be a positive influence in improving the finished outcome. What did get in the way were the hangers-on. In keeping with all studios, whenever a name band was in one of the rooms, musicians from the other would put their head round the door to see what was going on. Often they were co-opted onto the sessions doing background vocals or assorted percussive effects. This wasn't a problem. The real hassles were twofold. There were those who hang around on the fringes of the rock business currying favor with musicians by bringing drugs, and this was certainly a problem during the Axis sessions. And with Jimi around, the other problem was the women eager to get a private view of the man. October 22nd. Performing at Hastings Pier, Hastings, Sussex. Band lineup: the Jimi Hendrix Experience and the Orange Seaweed. No set list for the evening is available. October 23rd. Back at Olympic Sound Studios, London. The song, If 6 Was 9, originally recorded the 4th of May, 1967. Personnel: Jimi Hendrix, guitar, vocals, recorder and foot stomping. Noel Redding, bass, vocals. Mitch Mitchell, drums, congas. Graham Nash, foot stomping. Gary Walker, foot stomping, and Chaz Chandler, foot stomping. Note: at the very end of the track there is an indecipherable, faintly heard comment spoken by someone. This song was recorded in two pieces, Section A, which ends at 1:31, and Section B, beginning with the line White Collar Conservative, which were edited together to create a single basic track. Most copies have a 2 to 3 second silent gap between the sections, though some variations have as much as 6 seconds between the sections. The end section features Jimi playing recorder, and with he, Chaz Chandler, Graham Nash and Gary Walker stomping their feet on a drum platform. Overdubs for this track were done on 5th and 9th of May, 1967. Final mixing for this song was done on the 31st of October, 1967, but this song, which was part of Side A of the album, was lost by Hendrix when he left the master tape box in a taxicab that night. As it turned out, Noel Redding had a copy of the rough mix from the 31st of October on a 3-inch plastic reel, and it was this tape that was then transferred to what became the version heard on the album. October 24th, performing at the MARQUEE Club London, band lineup, the Jimi Hendrix Experience and the Nice, no set list available. According to those in the audience, the night is memorable for an apparent on-stage stouch between Hendrix and Redding, remembered as follows. Jimi moved his guitar over to Noel's amplifier and a wild battle ensued, with the guitars being used like swords. Suddenly, Jimi threw himself at little Noel, knocking him over, and the two of them rolled round and round on the floor. Quite an ending to the act. Asked about it later, Jimi said, "Oh man, you know, it was just supposed to be a guitar battle, but I fell." October 25th, Olympic Studios, London recording Wait Until Tomorrow and Little Wing. In relation to the recording of Little Wing. Personnel, Jimi Hendrix, guitar, vocals, glockenspiel, Noel Redding, bass, Mitch Mitchell, drums. Covered by artists like Eric Clapton, Stevie Ray Vaughan and Sting, Little Wing is one of Jimi Hendrix's most beautiful and enduring compositions. It's easy to see why. The original is seductively warm, poignant and light as a feather. Engineer Eddie Kramer explains how Jimi achieved the song's ethereal glow in the studio. One of my favorite touches on that track is the glockenspiel part, which was played by Jimi, says Kramer. Part of the beauty of recording at Olympic Studios in London was using instruments that had been left from previous sessions. The glockenspiel was just laying around, so Jimi used it. Hendrix's rich and watery guitar solo was, says Kramer, in part the product of a secret weapon. One of the engineers had built this miniature Leslie, continues Kramer. It was like it was built out of an Erector set and had a small 8-inch speaker that rotated. Believe it or not, the guitar solo was fed through this tiny thing, and that's the lovely effect you hear on the lead. But for the true meaning of Little Wing, it's best to go straight to the horse's mouth. Little Wing is like one of these beautiful girls that come around sometimes, explained Jimi. You ride into town for the drinks and parties and so forth. You play your gig. It's the same thing as the olden days. And these beautiful girls come around and really entertain you. You do actually fall in love with them because that's the only love you can have. It's not always the physical thing of, oh, there's one over there. It's not one of those scenes. They actually tell you something. They release different things inside themselves, and then you feel to yourself. Little Wing was a very sweet girl that came around that gave me her whole life, and more if I wanted it. And me with my crazy ass couldn't get it together, so I'm off here and there and off over there. October 26th, Olympic Studios, London recording Ain't No Tellin'. Special notes. This track, Ain't No Telling, uses take 15 from the recording session with the final end section edited on from one of a few takes specifically recorded for the end section. Final mixing for this song was done on the 31st of October 1967 with George Chikiantz as second engineer, but this song, which was part of side A of the album, was also lost by Hendrix when he left the master tape box in a taxicab that night, the 31st of October. The track had to be completely remixed the following day, the 1st of November 1967. October 27th, Olympic Sound Studios, London, recording Spanish Castle Magic. On this track, Noel Redding plays on a Hagstrom 8-string bass. At the time there were only 2 in the whole country. Jimi also plays it after having passed it through an Octavia pedal, which allows you to double a note an octave lower or higher. The guitar and bass are played in unison. There is also a piano played by Jimi. Once again, everything will be remixed at the last minute, due to Jimi having forgotten the original tapes for side A of the album in a taxi. The title of this song refers to the Spanish Castle Club in Seattle, where Jimi performed in his early days. October 28th, performing California Ballroom Dunstable in Bedfordshire. While earlier that day, Olympic Sound Studios, London, recording Spanish Castle Magic and Little Wing, the song Spanish Castle Magic. Personnel, Jimi Hendrix, guitar, vocals, piano, bass, Noel Redding, bass, Mitch Mitchell, drums. Special notes. The basic track recorded the 27th of October and overdubs done on the 28th of October. This track uses the final take 14 from the 28th of October session. Overdubs were also done on the 28th of October. Hendrix recorded his lead vocal, added lead guitar parts, and replaced portions of Redding's original bass track. Additional vocal and percussion overdub refinements were done on the 30th of October. As the session evolved in the studio, Eddie Kramer translated the song's chord progression on the piano, suggesting, as he had done with Are You Experienced, the use of piano to accentuate Hendrix's rhythm guitar. Jimi also played bass, the same Hagstrom 8-string used in the recent Curtis Knight sessions, further enhanced by feeding the sound through the octave boosting Octavia. Final mixing for this song was done on the 31st of October, but this song, which was part of side A of the album, was lost by Hendrix when he left the master tape box in a taxicab that night. The track had to be completely remixed the following day, the 1st of November. October 29th, Olympic Studios, London, recording Up From the Skies and Bold as Love. According to Chas Chandler, the texts of Up From the Skies, as well as Third Stone from the Sun, were directly inspired by the novel Earth Abides by George R. Stewart, one of the books in Chandler's library, to which Jimi had free access in the early days of the experience when they lived in the same apartment. The song Castles Made of Sand was originally recorded on the 10th of October session. Notes: this track contains some backwards guitar segments, while studio logs suggest that take 18 became the basic track. Overdubs were done on the 27th of October 1967, with final mixing done on the 31st of October. October 30th, Olympic Studios, London, recording Wait Until Tomorrow, She's So Fine, and Spanish Castle Magic. The Axis sessions, Noel Redding recalled. We worked hard, and Axis, Bold as Love, was finished on the 30th of October. I really enjoyed the creation of Axis. It's my favorite Experience album. We felt positive and reasonably relaxed during the sessions, trying to take our own time, even though it was made plain that at least 3 record companies were drumming their fingers anxiously awaiting the product. We'd slipped into the routine of doing a gig and then heading to the studio for a midnight to early morning session. Our outlook on music, drugs, and women was highly experimental at that point. In the studio, we started playing around with electronic noise. While Jimi and Mitch, his voice speeded up, did weird voiceovers, we'd set up a couple of guitars, turn the volume up full, and smash them against the amps for the background. Other groups relied on using a variety of instruments to keep new, but we relied on Jimi's irrepressible urge to experiment with new guitar sounds, which he did with a vengeance, especially now that he had embraced pedals. With my bass turned up to full treble, we got a tremendous variety of effects, both on stage and in the studio. Record companies put a terrible strain on the gigging composing artist who couldn't or wouldn't just cover an oldie or choose from a selection of songs written for him, expecting 2 or 3 LPs a year. Tuesday, October 31st, interviews with Jimi and Mitch in London by Pete Goodman for Beat Instrumental, published in January 1968. The Jimi Hendrix Experience had finished working on what was to become Axis Bold as Love. There was a marathon mixing session at Olympic Studios, presided over by Chandler, Hendrix, and Kramer. 13 songs, including EXP, would make up the new album. For 4 days, Hendrix, Chandler, and Kramer labored over the tapes before finally finishing during the early hours of the 31st, 1967, Halloween. Somehow, and even now, no one is exactly sure how, Hendrix proceeded to lose the mixes for what was to become Side 1. Still living together, Hendrix and Chandler had taken the final masters home to their apartment. As Chandler surmises, Hendrix was eager to audition the Experience's new album and had taken the masters before any safety copies had been made. According to Chandler, he went off to a party and took the masters with him. Coming back, he left one of the boxes in a taxi. It was all scheduled for a release. So we rang up Eddie and went to Olympic the next night and mixed the entire A side of the album again, all in one night. For Kramer, the news was painful. The mixes that they had labored on, deriving from only 4-track tapes, were almost performances in themselves. Ideas and sounds, flying by the seat of our pants, as Kramer described it, were gone. By means of an explanation, Hendrix mumbled something about a party to both Kramer and George Chikentz, tape operator throughout the final mixing sessions, but regardless of where the original tapes were, Chandler, Hendrix, and Kramer had little choice but to return to the half-inch 4-track multi-track originals and start anew. As he mentions in his book, Setting the Record Straight with John McDermott. The one song that we just couldn't get right was If 6 Was 9, recalls Chandler. We kept saying to ourselves, I'm sure this isn't the sound we had originally. Noel had a 7.5 IPS, 3-inch reel made from a rough mix done in June, and we had to send someone off into a taxi to his flat to bring it back. It was on a tiny spool and was all wrinkled. It had not been used on domestic machines, so we practically had to iron it to flatten it enough to go through the machine. We copied it to 15 IPS and put it on the album. To this day, people still say to Chandler and Kramer, "The sound you created on If 6 Was 9 was so good." Their reply, more than 20 years later, remains, "If only you knew." That concludes episode 15 in this series. Stay tuned for the next installment, where we will examine November 1967 of the Hendrix story. Please remember to check the channel's community tab and video information page, where you will find links to any related videos, performances, and stunning photographs from the period, and any updates. Also, don't forget to subscribe for future content updates. By the way, if you have any stories or anecdotes to contribute, we would love to hear from you. Lastly, thank you so much for your wonderful comments and continuing support.